then the next, I would like to invite our next presenter from, they're from University of Tokyo. And so please invite Assistant Professor Dina Kartika and also Assistant Professor Kitamura. And let us say sorry if you cannot pronounce your name correctly.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for introducing us. I am Diana, and my co-presenter, Associate Professor Kitamura, he will continue later after I have introduced the research. So let me begin by saying that, let me start the slideshow. Okay. So first, in the first 10 minutes, we are going to spend some time sharing data and our findings from a research that we did with JICA in 2015. And based on our findings, Professor Kitamura will continue to have to bring up some important issues in mentoring educators for including students with disabilities in classrooms in Cambodia. So what we have found out so far was in terms of past studies, there have been a lot of information about how there is positive impact of knowledge and information of teachers' attitudes towards inclusive education of students with disabilities in public education, or the positive impact of pre-service training, in-service training on teachers' attitudes towards inclusive education. And of course, there is also positive impact on the on teachers' experience, how much experience they have with students' disabilities, and how it affects their attitudes towards including students with disabilities in the classrooms. So there is a lot of data about how knowledge, experience, and training helps attitudes towards inclusion in the classroom. However, a lot of this data are based on developed countries, and therefore, for this project that the JICA was doing, we decided to focus on a country like Cambodia. So in Cambodia, disability, there is a definition by the government on the law on protection and promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities from 2009 that refers to anyone who lacks, loses, or has ruined physical organs or mental impairment and psychological impairments, things like this, which result in abnormal states. So there is that image that a disability is abnormal or not normal. And people with disabilities in Cambodia have a certified document of disability, which allows them to receive services for people with disabilities, but not all of them are properly captured and included under this system. Based on the data we found, about only 4.7% of the disabled population are under 20 years of age. And the other issue that we had difficulty trying to put together was that there was no standardized disability classification system that is uniform across all the government ministries and including the NGOs, the many NGOs and agencies in Cambodia. And in terms of current practices for children with disabilities in Cambodia, there are some special schools. Maybe many of you are familiar with Krusat Mai. They run programs for students who are blind or deaf, and there are also some programs at Handicap International. MOUIS initiative also gave NGOs more movement to have inclusion of students with disabilities by having integrated classrooms. So gradually allowing students with moderate disabilities to study in government schools. And there was also a inclusive education model in 9 primary schools that they tried to build in Cambodia based on their study of a successful Lao PDR model. And in terms of laws and policies in Cambodia, there is the National Education Strategic Plan that identified the need for a national policy and strategies for learners with disability, Under the Education Law of 2008, there are 2 articles that seeks to discuss and include students with people with disabilities. There is also the Protection and Promotion of Rights of Disabled Persons Law that reaffirms this Article 39 of the Education Law. There is also the Policy for Education of Children with Disabilities. And at the provincial teacher training centers, which are 2 of them, there are also inclusive education parts or aspects in the training of the general 2-year training course. And so we focused on the teacher training training that teachers receive and the experience that they have in dealing with students with disabilities. The World Bank teacher training has an inclusive education training in Cambodia, and it looks at it does in-service teacher training. The Ministry of Education also has some modules for inclusive education within the teacher training curriculum, and this was revised in 2012. However, we also felt that there was very little data that we could find about how many teachers exactly have received training. And at the point of this study, when we were doing it, there was no official data on teachers who are teaching students with disabilities. So we are unable to track exactly who is teaching students with disabilities and get feedback on the kind of difficulties they are facing, and which would line up with the difficulties in perhaps mentoring the people who need mentoring. And based on there's a situation analysis on inclusive education training courses, and the limited development of inclusive education teacher training is partly because the training itself is quite short, only 4 to 5 days, and the tutors, the people who are doing the training themselves were found to have very limited knowledge. So in facing those problems, for this study, we had 3 main questions. One was, does training and experience affect teachers' perspectives on how students with disabilities should be educated? Number 2, does training and experience affect teachers' perspectives on the possibility of educating students with disabilities in regular classrooms? And number 3, what are the teachers' perspectives of possibility of inclusive education, depending on the different types of disabilities? So on those 3 questions, we had 2 types of methodologies. One was quantitative and qualitative. So for the quantitative one, the focus is, of course, children with disabilities, but also without disabilities. We wanted to find out the impact on both groups of students. These are the sections of the survey. Because of the time that we have today, I would not be able to cover all of them. But if you're interested to find out more about our quantitative methodology, we have a working paper, and we will be most glad to share and discuss any other things that you would like to find out about our survey. So our survey was done in 5 places: 1, Battambang, Ratanakiri, Kampot, Kandal, and also, of course, Phnom Penh. In terms of the types of disabilities, if you remember, this was question 3, the types of disabilities. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 types of disabilities across the 5 places that we did the research in. So in total, we had 412 children with disabilities of focus that we did the research regarding. For the teachers, so 448 teachers that we did the studies with, and they were the teachers of the children with disabilities we were focusing on. The average age for about 41, and the level of education, the most of them are have upper high school education level, less than 20% higher education, and for the rest of them, primary and lower high school education. Average years of training, about 19 years of training. And this part here, training, in-service and pre-service training, is one of our focus that we were looking at for this study. For pre-service, majority, 97.5%, quite healthy, received pre-service training for teaching students with disabilities. But when it comes to in-service training, it falls to a lower 80.6. And the training it's a specific training to teach to children with disabilities, it was a much lower 20.5% only. And so I mentioned we have two types of methodologies. The second methodology to complement the quantitative studies we had was qualitative methodology. For that, we use a critical communicative method, which focuses on the role of dialogue in between the interviewer and the interviewee as a tool. Dialogue as a tool to raise the social actors' consciousness. So in this sense, to raise the consciousness of Cambodian teachers themselves, so as to empower them to be able to consider the different social structures that are limiting them and how they themselves can transform the structures that they are in. For that, we conducted interviews with parents, focus groups with teachers and parents, as well as observations in schools with the principals. This was done over 2 weeks, and we interviewed 8 school directors, 24 teachers, 21 parents, and 3 parents of children without disabilities. So this was for the qualitative interviews. Right, so looking at the findings, the first one is about training. So the first focus we have for training, 2 questions that I'd like to introduce here. How should children with disabilities be educated? Second question, children with disabilities have the right to be educated in regular classrooms. So in response to these classrooms, we have teachers with training, their response, and teachers without training, their response. And what we found was that if we did a very simple chi-square survey, we found that there was actually, it reflected that there was no relationship between teacher training and the type of education that is preferred. And therefore, it was difficult to conclude, or rather not statistically not possible to conclude that there is a relationship between the training that Cambodian teachers receive and that it does affect their perspectives positively on how children with disabilities should be educated. So normally we would think that the more training someone receives, they would be more open to receiving children with disabilities, but this was not what the results reflected. And to complement the quantitative surveys, when we did the interviews with the teachers, they told us about how they lack confidence, skills, resources to teach in inclusive classrooms which include students with and without disabilities. So some of the quotes that we have from the teachers, they say they're not equipped with skills, very challenging, they lack training and materials, they try by themselves, but they don't know and they're not sure. Or for parents, they don't even know how the teachers teach and they don't feel convinced, they don't feel persuaded that their child is learning. And we also found out that there is occasional training by the ministry for selected teachers of selected classrooms. So in a way, cascade training, some people are trained upwards, but once those selected teachers from selected schools are trained, when they go back to the school, there is often no sharing within the school of the knowledge and their information that is gained. So, and for the next point, we are now looking at experience. This is the second point. So how does experience affect teachers' perspectives? So again, the 2 questions are how should children with disabilities be educated, and that children with disabilities have the right to be educated in classrooms. So in terms of experience, when we do the same kind of chi-square test, we also find that there is no relationship between experience and the type of education preferred. So usually we would think that when a teacher has more experience in teaching children with disabilities, they might gain some confidence or they might have more knowledge, and therefore they would think that type of education for inclusive education for children with disabilities might be more possible. So that might be expected, but the results showed that having more experience did not lead to more more possibility of the type of education for children with disabilities. And complementing that, for qualitative findings, teachers talk about how they did not have enough knowledge to interact with students with disabilities or to teach students with disabilities because of the lack of training. And because of the lack of training, they don't know how to interact, they don't know how to teach. They feel a lack of confidence in teaching students with disabilities. And it, in a way, it's like a vicious cycle, which results in a negative, usually negative, and at best, neutral experience in teaching students with disabilities. So these are some quotes. For example, one teacher said, "I tried my best to teach, speak, write, and listen for 4 subjects, but they still don't understand and I had difficulty explaining." Of course, teaching them is more difficult than normal students, but and even if they try to give more attention, they find that it affects the pace of other students without disabilities, and they don't know how to manage students with and without in the same classroom. One more teacher was talking about how they try their best, but sometimes even the parents blame them. So the entire experience of teaching students with disabilities is not only limited to within the classroom. The circumstances in Cambodia also leave teachers with very little time and energy to accommodate or pay attention to the special needs of students with disabilities, because of the low teacher salary, and it requires or necessitates them to take on day jobs that takes away their energy to prepare for classes that would be needed to accommodate students with disabilities. So they have very little time for preparation. They have very little time to reflect on the problems they face and how to solve them. There is also a general lack of resource available. For example, braille printers for students with disability who are blind. And in terms of collaboration, it is not very conducive environment for implementing. And for the third one, teachers' perceptions on the possibility of inclusion by the 9 types of disabilities, you will see here, the blue ones are not possible at all. So the ones that are really high for types of disabilities that are not possible at all to include are students who are deaf, students who are blind, and students who have severe or multiple disabilities. So these 3 types are particularly high. And so it was found that they find it significantly much more difficult than the other types of disabilities, even including intellectual disabilities. And so there are different kinds of approaches. And from here, I will invite Professor Kitamura to talk about how those different approaches and what they mean for mentoring teachers that are involved with students with disabilities. Professor Kitamura.
Okay, thank you very much. I have been already responding to some of the questions raised in the chat system, and I hope what I responded made sense to the audience. And since we have a limited time, I mean, I'm not going to explain details about these different types of disabilities. But what we would like to emphasize is that, each teacher, I mean, although they have a very limited experiences of receiving the teacher training in order to understand what are the challenges, how they should treat the students with disabilities. However, at the same time, based on their experiences, teachers are aware of the different types of disabilities. So what we like to suggest here is that, teachers have experiences and some teachers have a good understanding, but at the same time, their understanding is very much limited based on their limited experiences. So that's why we need to provide more mentoring to the teachers who need to treat students with disabilities in a proper manner. So please move on to the next slide, Diana-san. And that's why we have come up with these policy implications. First and foremost, what we need to do is to provide proper training to teachers to understand what are the challenges for the students with disabilities. Okay, that's very much needed. However, you haven't done much yet. So but in order to do this, it's not only teachers, but also the people in the community have to understand as well that this kind of, raising the social awareness of disabilities is also important. So, of course, this conference is meant to mentor teachers, but at the same time, teachers need to communicate with people in the community, including the parents. What are the challenges with disabilities? But at the same time, what sort of possibilities even the students with disabilities have, they are not just limited, but they have a lot of possibilities as well. If teachers and the students and the people surrounding the children with the disabilities in a proper manner, they can do so many things. Okay, so that's one thing we really would like to emphasize. But of course, you need a budget to do. So the donors have to work together as well. And then there has to be a greater collaborations. Could you move on to the next slide? And the message we like to share in the end is that, basically, as I have already explained in the chat function, why we share these research results, because we just didn't want to give a simple advice to the teachers what to do. I mean, we really want to share why, what are the realities there. That's why we share the research findings first. But at the same time, we would like to encourage teachers to pay more attention on how to teach students with disabilities in the time of SDGs. In the era of SDGs. So I think these figures are quite clear. Before, when we talked about education for the children with disabilities, first we try to provide equal resources to everyone, but that's not enough for students with disability, which is very obvious, which the figure on the left-hand side shows. So that's why now the inclusive education is really trying to provide more resources, providing the equitable, providing the resources in an equitable manner to students who are needed more than others. But this, equity is not enough because, the student with disability may be treated differently from others, and then that's not fair. That's not right. So that's why we need to go on for the systematic change, which the figure on the right hand shows. So let me share just one example. If you have the student with blind, who has a very difficulty to see, in the past and still today, not only in Cambodia, but also many other countries, when blind students are sitting in classroom, what we do, we try to provide special equipment or someone to assist, but we never thought about the way teachers teach. The systemic change on the right-hand side shows, we like to encourage teachers to change their pedagogy, the way they teach. If they can teach in a manner that no matter whether students are blind or not, if everybody can understand, there's no need for the special equipment, no need for the special teachers to support. So teachers have to ask yourself, how to change your pedagogical approach to make everyone, every student, no matter whether they are blind or not, the way they can understand. So that's the last message we would like to share, and then that's I hope that's the message somehow meets the objective of this conference. Okay, so I hope you could have some ideas. But thank you very much, and we very much appreciate your response and the questions. So that's end of our presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for both of you for giving the meaningful presentation. So like we have many questions, but you already answer it in the Zoom chat box. So Dr. Katiruma and Dina, if you have something to say to the participants.
Diana-san, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So yes, we received a few questions, and most of it we were able to answer on the Zoom chat. But of course, I suppose that there might be many of us who have questions that maybe you would start thinking about after the presentation. So we would like to invite you to contact us. There is the forum, I think, that the organizers have created for communication for the participants and us after the presentation. So if you have any other questions after this, please forward them there, or you can get in touch through our email addresses also. Professor Kitamura?
Okay, thank you. I just would like to quickly respond to some of the questions which seem to share the similar interest. I mean, yes, we consider, I mean, you know, we are not only considering the physical disabilities or mental disabilities as disabilities, but, you know, disabilities can include, you know, a variety of challenges the kids are facing. And in that sense, you know, in fact, including myself, everybody is not perfect. So that's the basic idea why we need to promote inclusive education, you know, why we need to include everyone, because we consider everybody has different characters, everybody has different talents, everybody has different ways to learn. So, you know, the idea of inclusive education really consider all of us as, you know, to some extent, everybody has some challenges. That's why we need to study with the guidance of the teachers, support of the teachers. So I really like to tell the teachers, I mean, there must be many teachers watching this video that, you know, if you are aware of this, then your pedagogical approach must change. So today, in this session, in this presentation, we take up disabilities or inclusive education as one example to think further. So I think, you know, you can think of what sort of the pedagogical changes or pedagogical transformation of your pedagogy you can think of. You know, that's I really like to encourage. And then that, in order to do that, you may like to remember the last slide. There is, you know, those three figures, what those means, and how you can apply that in your teaching practice in the classrooms, and then how you can make the systemic changes. Of course, you know, I'm sure you will make some changes, and then I very much look forward to that. So that's my response. Diana-san, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for your participants in this session. So it's time, and then you can relax now.
So Diana-san, maybe you have a final word.
Yes, there is a question by one last question about the class size. I think we don't have any more time to continue with it, but about how to monitor and assess student learning. And I'm not sure whether the question here is targeted at students with disabilities or general per se. But this is, I think, a classroom size is a common problem, whether or not is students with disabilities. So perhaps if we don't have time now, dear organizer, maybe you would like us to take this discussion to the forum?
Yes, sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.